Hello guys, welcome back. This is the second video on the clutch and primary cover. And I was just looking back at the video. Sorry, I think I maybe spent a lot of time trying to get that retaining nut out. But this video will be to just go over the components that were removed from the primary case. And we'll be inspecting the chain in this video. So as you will have seen, with the inside of this primary cover and the case itself and elsewhere on the bike, someone at some point in time has spent a lot of time carefully painting the insides with this red Gliptal paint enamel, and a very nice job they've done too of it. And so yeah, thank you whoever that was. I really appreciate it. Anyway, getting back to this project, as you no doubt saw, we've got this standard, what seems to be the standard Vincent Servo clutch. I'm not going to take that apart at all at the moment. Just going to put it back together. The shoes look like they're in decent condition. They've been cut and grooved there. So I know I've got a lot of friends who've already swapped these out for the modern day ones that are available, but I just need to get this back in the bike running, and then I'll make my own mind up in terms of whether I need to replace this. There's the clutch drum in very good condition. These little screws were quite tricky to get out, but I think what it is, we've got some locking washers under there, so that probably helped with some of the resistance that you may have seen in the video. One other thing I will be looking at is this huge seal here for the housing for the clutch, and I haven't even looked at it yet, but we'll need to inspect that out. The last thing I want is a oil leaking through this boss or this housing into the clutch. Here's the chain adjuster here passing through the bottom of the primary case with the locking nut. And you see it's all the way threaded all the way to the end, pushing on this tensioner here, this chain tensioner, and which indicates that someone's tightened as the chain's got slacker and slacker and slacker. And we're now out of thread basically. So in order to bring this back, we probably need to replace the chain. I'm pretty certain of it, but we'll measure it just in case. It's super slack right now because I haven't refitted the clutch assembly that will recenter this clutch hub here, and then we'll get a much better reading on how slack or tight the chain is. But I think inevitably we're going to have to replace this. In order to replace the chain, we need to take this off, this shock absorber system, and this will then come off altogether, very much like a Norton or a Triumph, where you bring the whole lot off together. One thing I've just noticed, there's a link here. So if it goes all the way through, that's terrific. I will be able to undo the chain here and then replace it. But I thought this was a continuous chain without links, but possibly a different chain. Anyway, we will see. Terrific. So here's the inside of the primary case, just after a little bit of time cleaning it up, making it look a little bit neater than what it was. As you can see, someone spent a lot of time here in the past and they've done an excellent job. I mean, that looks like a brand new bearing here. Someone's gone to the trouble, I mean, these are supposed to be safety wired, but soldering them afterwards as well. Just the little finer points. Here the adjuster, it spins by hand. It's obviously got the end taken care of so that it doesn't run all the way out of the case. The main drive sprocket looks very good. So all in all, it looks terrific in here. Oh yeah, cleaned up the edges of the case to accept the new gasket when that comes. So yeah, very happy with what it looks like on the inside. I'll also take a look at the push rod as well. I haven't seen what that looks like yet. And then it's looking at the clutch, generally speaking, but as I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to take it apart. And so now we'll turn our attention to the chain and see what that looks like. So as you can see, the chain that I took off, I measured it just with a tape measure, and it measured about 1/2 inch, possibly 3/8 to 1/2 inch longer than the standard chain, which would explain why that adjuster was so far in, or part of that anyway. And what I've done next is I've stacked up the chain that I took off, which is the bottom one. You'll see with the link, alongside 2 other old chains that I got off my friend John, just for comparison. So as you'll see, they look at first glance that they're about the same, but then they're all worn anyway, so not a good reference point. But you'll see just at the end there, it's just a little bit longer, the bottom chain, than the other 2 on the top. And so as we go back over here, all the pitches seem to line up quite nicely, and it's beginning to drift at the bottom. You see that as the chain has stretched, or the rollers have worn down, to the point where as we get right to the end, it's out quite a bit. So I don't think that's 1/2 inch, but it does give you an indicator that, well, it's 1/2 inch over the standard chain, so the other 2 probably are also stretched as well. What I'm going to do next then is I'm going to put the chain back on the bike, and just to give myself some reassurance as to why it seemed like it was so slack. Well, I'm definitely going to buy a new chain, that's for certain, but what I'd like to do is just explore a little bit of why the other chain was so slack and this adjuster was all the way in. The tensioner was here as well, and I'll look at that in a minute. And if you remember, we had the sprocket with the chain on it earlier that was offset, and therefore the chain was super slack. What we can do then is we just take this clutch shoe carrier, which I got from my friend John, so thanks a lot, John, as a spare, and insert that into the sprocket, and then place that back on the spline, which centers the sprocket. And now if I put the chain back on, the original chain back on, I should be able to, and the tensioner, I should be able to measure just how slack it was before I go ahead and get the new chain. So I should have probably done this before I took the chain off, but this is the chain back on now. This is the one with the link in it. And in order to simulate the tightness of the chain with the clutch on, I'm using this spare clutch shoe. Thank you very much, John. And that centers through the clutch sprocket, so it centers it onto the spline. And then I've got the tensioner here fitted, and I'll come back to the adjuster. But with the ruler set on a firm square surface, I've put a point on the ruler at 7.25 or 7.25 inches on that pitch right there, that little reference point there on the chain, and then move the chain up and down at various intervals, turning the chain around, trying to find places equally across the chain to see how much play we have in it. And I'm not sure if you saw it, but it went down to about 7 inches and up. This was a little tighter, this point here, but potentially up to about 7.75 inches as well. So that tells me that there are spots on this chain where I've got 3/4 inch play. And let's not forget that the adjuster is all the way in as well. And so a very slack chain. Obviously this chain needs to be replaced, if anything, just for the link. This should be the endless chain. And so, yeah, I think I've concluded that definitely this chain has had it and needs to be replaced. So I wasn't sure if you heard that noise just then. I thought one of the springs had dropped out. And it wasn't a complete spring. It was part of a spring. So as I've been loosening off this washer, these two little pieces of spring have fallen out. So I'm glad I'm looking at this. I mean, it is possible that I just did this when I was using the hammer to unlock this nut. Oh, there's another piece there in my hand. Well, this is fascinating. The two little parts were the internal springs that had broken off, these PD27 internal springs. This is concentric spring, so a spring within a spring, and it's the inner springs that, oh my gosh, that just shattered. Did you see that? In my fingers right there. So they've completely had it. So the external springs may be okay, but internal springs definitely, look at all those. And so, yeah, I'll be buying a brand new set of springs. But what you may have also noticed when I was taking the nut off is here behind, there's what they call this spring ring. And you see the dimples or indents or seats on this ring, they were facing out, when normally we'd expect them to face in as the seats for the springs on the other side as they go into here. And that would hold them all in place, of course, naturally. Well, what we had with this bike is this was flat on the inside. I've done a little research, and what I've determined is having these seats, or the dimples, facing in was not always a good thing, actually, in that it, in some cases, accelerated the breakage of the springs. And so a mod was to turn it round the other way. But in so doing that, what you do is you lose the the dimensions of this ring. So actually you go to the thicker dimension, and therefore, because they're not sitting in the seats, and therefore when you clamp it down, you're actually putting more pressure on the springs, and they become coil bound and in fact can break even more. And so there's a new mod that I'm aware of, a new modified plate, which is the thickness of this ring at the dimensions of the dimples. So in other words, it's thinner than thicker. And then you've got a flat surface, no seats, and it just goes back on and makes for just a better engineered product. So that's what I'll do. I'll go ahead and order the new ring that's flat, and a brand new set of springs, the inner springs PD27s and the outer springs PD6.